Hello, in this presentation, I'd like to present to you the witnesses of democracy. What I'm trying to do here is not to condemn democracy, nor am I going to suggest any other form of mechanisms to manage ourselves. What I'm trying to do here is just to acknowledge that there are witnesses in the democracy as we know it today. For a long time, different theoreticists had argued that when human society evolves, from the Marx point of view, Karl Marx point of view, the human society will eventually become a communist state. Whereas, on the other hand, for example, Francis Fukuyama argues that when human society evolves, it will eventually become a market-oriented democratic state. Of course, both claims cannot be true at the same time, but they can both be wrong. My suggestion here is that any ideologies actually hurt. They are not real. So I would rather believe that our mechanism of organizing ourselves will evolve as we progress. So let's compare several examples here. The examples I want to focus on is China and USA. First of all, we know that China has progressed a lot in the last 30 years. The rate of growth, especially in GDP terms, is at a 10% per year and consistently for almost 30 years. That has never happened in the past history. So what is this force behind the growth of China? So I'm asking the question, what has the Chinese done right? Well, we noticed that the Chinese have used a gradual removal of market efficiencies. What I mean by that is that, first of all, they open up the cities along the coast, and that allows farmers to join as a laborer or a worker in these factories. With this opening, that the excess agricultural labor is being utilized in factories, and with that supply of labor, China becomes the world's largest factory. Another important point to note that is that the implementation of different policies, for example, a special economic zone, is on a test basis. It first tested the economic zone in Shenzhen before it expands into other areas. So China adopted a test before full-scale implementation strategy. At the same time, China also maintains a very tight control on the currency. For a long time, actually, there were two different currencies being used within China. One is what they call the foreign exchange, and the other being the renminbi. And so if you want to do business, you want to pay your sellers or whatever you want to pay in exchange currency, then you must have some exchange foreign currency in the first hand before you can do that. So the amount of export-import is tightly controlled. About the state-owned enterprises, there's a lot of talk about the state-owned enterprises being inefficient, they based on past models and so forth. Despite of that, Chinese doesn't allow the state-owned enterprises to change hands almost overnight. That is in contrast to what happened when Soviet Union fell and then becomes Russia. Most of the work done by Chinese government focuses on infrastructure. So that is what I see as what Chinese have done. Is that right or not? We don't know, but at least the Chinese can grow in the last 30 years. Other people have their own opinion as well. For example, Francis Fukuyama argues that China was a sophisticated modern state back about 3rd century BC, so that would be 2,000 years or more. At that stage, what he means by sophisticated modern state refers to that the state is run by bureaucrats, and the decisions are made based on reasons and is impartial. So this kind of governance has been with the Chinese for 2,000 plus years. So the rapid rise of the current Chinese government is partly based on this ability to tap into this deep wealth of knowledge and the skills in the Confucius tradition. So what is the Confucian tradition? The Confucian tradition is to train future ruler to rule justly. We have the idea of so-called the heaven mandate. If you lost the mandates, then your rule will over and then somebody will take over. So in order to maintain this mandates from the heaven, you have to be just and kind to the citizens. So that is very much into the Confucius tradition. Another political scientists argue that the Chinese government is a directed improvisations. What he meant is that as the Chinese government trying to improve its policy or change its policy, it knows where it wants to go, but it doesn't really know how to do it. So the Chinese government will just have to improvise as the society develops. This is very much similar to what I mentioned before, that the Chinese will experiment before applying this principle throughout China. Lastly, but not the least, Eric Li, a Chinese entrepreneur born in Shanghai. When he was young, he was told that communism is the ultimate way humans will organize our society. But when he studies in the US, he was told that eventually human society will become market-oriented, a democracy. So he has a TED video. You can do a search on his name, and then on a TED, he discussed about this, his view. One of the points I want to raise from his point of view is that the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, runs a very efficient human resource department. The argument is that out of the almost 100,000 low-level workers, only about 300 eventually end up in the political center. So there is a lot of competitions. Even for the current President Xi Jinping, it took him over 30 years to work from the lower into the eventual head of the state. Another Chinese scholar, Professor Drrang, argues that there are 8 points about how the Chinese have achieved what they have achieved. Well, some of the points has already been mentioned, so I will just quickly go through it. First of all is practical and test. So basically about trying out a policy before it widespread implementation. One of the big suggestions from him is that the government always remain strong. That is again in contrast to the fall of the Soviet Union into the Russia. The government weakens when the Soviet Union fell, and the Russia at the beginning stage have 2 years of reduction of GDP, and then it was until Putin come into office that the GDP start to rise again. So that is one of his arguments. The other argument he mentioned is that about the stability. Now, since the Ming Dynasty after Drrang visited the east coast of Africa, China closed its border. So that's another point here is the open to the world. The change is the changing from a closed society into an open society, open to the world. But what the argument is that at that time, China was one of the leading world in terms of the ability to sell to everywhere, in terms of its economics, in terms of its culture. If it is not the leader, it will be one of the leaders. But since the closing of the border, what happened in Europe during the Renaissance, Chinese have no knowledge. So when the Chinese and the European met again, Chinese is in a very poor condition and cannot defend the Chinese. So for the last 250 years, until China opened in 1978, China's have not enjoyed any long-term duration of stability. The maximum time of stableness, being no war, etc., is about 7 to 8 years. Most of the time, there may be warlords fighting against each other. There may be changing of the dynasty from the Qing dynasty into the Republic. There are also invasions from the foreigners and so forth. So even after Mao took over China in 1949, there are the various kinds of revolutions. We have the famine, and then the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution, and so on, so on. So there wasn't any stability until Deng Xiaoping opened China, and then Chinese enjoyed 32 years of continuous stability. So he argued that that is a very important point about the growth of China. The other thing is the Chinese government focuses on the providing jobs and food and social services to the people. But in exchange, China doesn't give the people the freedom to elect. The government remains strong. This is also done in a gradual process, together with the testing and trying and or the policies. So that is a gradual process of change. The open and the reform is a gradual process. But although it is gradual, he can see an order. The way the Chinese government implemented all this reform is that they will try to tackle the easy thing first. For example, opening the cities along the coast and attract people from inland to work in these coastal cities, in factories, and that make the initial amount of capital. Then with this initial capital, the Chinese government is able to invest in the infrastructure. And you know, at the moment, Chinese have the longest high-speed rail in the world. It is actually have more than half of the world's high-speed rail. So that kind of investment had to come with a capital, and the capital was created by allowing the coastal cities to have factories and to manufacture different products for the rest of the world. So and then eventually what is now seeing is that the Chinese is trying to improve the wealth in the inner provinces. So that is hard, and therefore it will be done later. The relationship between the state-owned enterprise and the free market is that the Chinese way want to make them complementary to each other. They are not in competition. So some areas he strongly believes should be held by the government, and some areas can be liberated and use private investments. So Chinese is not opening a free market and letting everything to be done in a free market competition. There are some crucial enterprises that has to be held by the government. So that is what he considered the 8 most important points why Chinese can grow so fast in the last 37 years. Until the present President Xi Jinping, Chinese adopted a foreign policy advised by Deng Xiaoping. It consists of 5 different sentences. Basically, calm observation, observe what has been done right, and then we can find that, then we implement it. If it's done wrong, change, and so forth. And then be sure to go hold the ground. Don't give up any consensus. Deal with things calmly. But the most important thing, the most important part in this foreign policy is actually the last 2: keeping a low profile and try to make a difference. Keeping a low profile means in the international affair, Chinese do not interfere with other people's business, and they are trying to keep a low profile, doesn't want to be seen as a rising power. Of course, this has changed after Xi Jinping, but before that, Chinese have been growing and trying to be calm with everybody else. But on the other side, within China, Chinese are trying to make a difference, trying to improve the livelihood of the Chinese people. So that is the policy right until Xi Jinping. What have Chinese done? Have Chinese abandoned communism? Yes, of course. China today is nothing like a communism, although they call it the socialism with a Chinese characteristics. So anybody who had read, for example, George Orwell, know that when you say equal and more equal and that kind of thing, you have an adjective and that changes the whole thing. So the socialism with Chinese characteristics is nothing like socialism. But at the same time, they didn't pick up a complete free market nor democracy. In China, there's no free election. The election is only done within the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. General citizens do not have a voting right, so it is not a democracy. Okay, what about their market reforms? Well, as I have explained to you, the market reform is not a free market reform. There are certain areas which have tight control by the state, and the reform is introduced in a gradually controlled process, and the control is by the state. So it is not market reform. There is no democracy. Now, I have described what have happened in China, looking at some of the works that have been done in China to make Chinese grow so fast in the last 30 years. So in contrast, I'm going to look at the largest promoter of democracy, the USA. I'm asking the question, is USA a failing state? Is USA still as prosperous as it claimed to be, or as prosperous as in the past? So I know this is a question which will attract a lot of attack. Please, if you think you do not want to listen to this part, go ahead, you can jump ahead. But otherwise, please listen. Now, initially, I want to use a segment from the newsroom to explain to you the what is US is failing. But because of the copyright, I can't play that part of the video. So I would like you to click on the links in the description to watch the video, or you can watch it later on. Basically, what the video talk about is that US. Some people say US is great because it is diverse, because it has freedom, but we have to notice that, well, diverse is a very easily mistaken term. What do you mean by diverse? Looking at for example, the black people or the colored people in US, I don't think they are being treated equally. As for freedom, well, most of the country in the world has freedom. Even including China, you have a certain degree of freedom. Of course, you can't do everything. Something is forbidden, but most of the time, you are allowed to do almost everything. So freedom is not a quality which really makes the USA great. At the same time, looking at the US, for example, the literacy, the healthcare, the life expectancy, like education level, etc., US is not the number one. Most of them is right down in the scale. In terms of the infrastructure, for I think it's about 2 years or every 4 years, the American the American civil engineers do a report about the Americans' infrastructure. The report has been failing for the last couple of reports. It is estimated that in order to bring the U.S. Infrastructure back to a modern standard, U.S. need to spend approximately $4 trillion. But that money is not coming. Even when Obama announced that there's going to create a fund to help to improve the infrastructure, the fund is talking about $400 billion over 10 years. So that is a drop of the ocean. It's not enough. In terms of equality, I just have mentioned the colored people is definitely not as equal as the white. For example, there's almost one police killing every 26, 28 hours. So is that fair? I don't know. You judge. So there's a lot of other things not mentioned in the video, and I consider it as a failure as well. So you can argue whether US is failing or not, but there are signs of crack anyway. And I will be talking more about that in the actual slides about the weaknesses of democracy. Back in 1717, there's somebody called Alexander Tyler. But actually, these two paragraphs may not have been written by him, but anyway, it is mostly attributed to him. So let's read this. A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefit from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will eventually collapse due to the loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by a dictatorship. The average age of the world's greatest civilizations from the beginning of history has been around 200 years. During those 200 years, these nations always progressed through the following sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to complacency, from complacency to empathy, and from empathy to dependence, and from dependence back to bondage. This is known as the Taylor cycle. Of course, this is a Western view. So from the Western view, since religion is part of the Western culture, so that spiritual faith is right in there. Looking from the Chinese historical records, we know that the Chinese dynasty on average lasted 250 years. And every time after the dynasty collapse, there will be a little bit of chaos in the country, and eventually some strong men will conquer all the fighting warlords, and then we unite China again and go through the cycle again. So in China, the experience is not bondage and spiritual faith. That at least that two stages doesn't apply in China. What Chinese have been seeing is a continuous cycle of prosperity and then chaos, prosperity, and chaos. Usually the prosperity lasts about, judging from the age of the dynasty, 250 years, 250 to 300, so around 200 plus something. So it's almost the same with this Thailand cycle as observed in the Western world. Chinese has similar things, although the elements of the cycle are different. Okay, let's go to the main issues I'm presenting here. So what I'm trying to lay down the foundation is that democracy is not the ultimate form of government. We have to evolve our ways of governing ourselves somehow. But democracy definitely is not the ultimate, nor is communism. We know that communism failed. So both of these systems is not the ultimate form. So in order to further discuss about the weakness of the democracy, so I'm going to look at it one by one. So far I have accumulated 20 different weaknesses. So because there's 20, so that's I want to go through it pretty quickly. The first one is the short election cycle. Typically, a democracy will have a term of office of either 3 to 5 years. So within that time frame, the office may change. And that means the leadership may change. When the leaderships have changed, there are two consequences of that one. First of all, projects that last longer than this election cycle cannot be the primary focus of any government, because he only have this 3 to 5 years term of office. So any long-term project will not be the key to their policy. They will be more focused on more short-term projects. Additionally, when the government change, then the policy may change. So a long-term policy, a long-term project might just have to start again and again and again, over and over again. So that is one of the weakness of democracy. The government or the whatever governing the body cannot look at long-term problems. For example, climate change is a typical case of this one. So far in the Western democracies, there's almost no government paying a lot of attention towards that, maybe with the exception of Germany. The other weakness is, of course, every election costs money. And when you cost money, that means you need to find sponsors. And you have a Western democracy have legalized bribery. Basically, when a political donation is accepted, that means you are being bought by these donators. The donations is a form of bribery. Now, if you do not formulate policies which the donors like, you risk the chance of not getting any donation in the next election. And because election is short, the cycle is short, so you constantly need these donations coming in. And therefore, any elected leaders has constantly to try to appease these donors. And, well, that is bribery, isn't it? So it ends up politicians always meet the needs of special interest groups, especially those interest groups has a lot of money. Another weakness of the democracy is when the politicians is now treated as a profession, and the profession has constantly been challenged. You have to get elected, re-elected all the time. So the whole focus, maybe your term of office is only 3 or 4, whatever the period is. The policy that the politicians may have to think about how they can get re-elected in the next election, and that means the policy again, like as in the short election cycle, you can't make long-term elections promise or long-term project as a priority. And again, because they are a profession, and eventually they becomes distant with the real people. So a lot of politicians don't understand what the real life is. Well, because it is a competitive, especially in two-party systems, it is a competition between two parties. So either you actually have a good idea, or alternatively, you can just destroy the opposition. If you can destroy the opposition, that means you are the one left there, and then you got elected. So a lot of negative politics is being played out. The whole purpose is to attack the opposite, no matter what the opposite is suggesting. For example, if you are not in government at the moment, then whatever government policies is putting on, you try to sabotage the policy, make sure the policy fail, or change the policy so that it lost all its original ideas and so forth. So there's a lot of negative politics we can see in the Western democracy. Especially I'm pointing here is United States. The other weakness is we have no evidence that democracy can elect the best leader. The example I'm quoting here is our current Prime Minister Tony Abbott. He is far from being a competent leader. Well, some of the elected area is what they call the marginal seats. For marginal seats, the parties will try to win over these marginal seats in order to get into power. For those areas which has quite a definite tendency to vote for a certain party, they are not paying so much attention to them. The attention during every election is on these marginal seats. In order to win over these marginal seats, they are usually proposing some kind of welfare policy to buy the votes from these marginal seats. Therefore, it is a reverse of this bribery. Now, the politicians is using public purse to buy votes for themselves. This kind of policy may only benefit this electric that area, but is may be bad for the country. So it is again not working for the country as a whole, but rather using a welfare policy to buy votes in marginal seats. Now, when it is a two-party system, or even a three-party or four-party, whatever, the wealthy interest groups can basically just buy off all the politicians, no matter who. And then when people try to elect among them, basically you are not electing something any difference there, because they are all bought. One example I'm trying to figure out is, for example, the United States spend approximately $600 billion per year on defense. Approximately, some years bigger, some years smaller. For example, this year for 640 billion, but different years different. So let's round up, say 600 billion. If this military-industrial complex agree to spend, say, 1% of their government funding as public relationship, that means this public relationship, the lobby groups, will have approximately $6 billion to be spent among the two houses of the Congress. So both houses together have around 300 to 500 politicians. So divide that 6 billion over these 500 something politicians. So on average, they can spend about $6 million on each of them. That $6 million is a lot more than the annual salary of these politicians. Do you think this military-industrial complex can buy all the votes? Up to you. Democracy also have built in a lot of so-called checks and balances. Check and balances, that means the president cannot do whatever he likes. He had to get the Congress approval. The Congress was there's a lot of this kind of thing happening. Now, the example here I'm quoting is since 2014, the Republicans is now majority in both houses in United States. That means Obama being a Democratic president, his bills will not be passed. So basically, that means in these last 2 years of his term of office, he cannot work much for the country where he is the president. Rather, he is forced to focus on foreign affairs. Well, there is also another interesting thing just happened not too long ago. The Congress wrote an open letter to Iran, sabotaging the nuclear weapon negotiations with Obama. Basically, what the open letter says is that the Obama presidency will finish in 2 years' time, but the congressman will be still there. So whatever agreement you have made with Obama will be revoked, will have to be approved by the Congress, which won't be approved. And then, so whatever agreement here you had is a executive agreements. That executive agreements only holds until Obama is in office. Once Obama is out of office, then everything go back to normal. Well, what can you say about this kind of letter? Well, because it is a democracy, because it's a two-party system, so that thing happens. In some other cases, the bureaucrats working for the government for years on and off, they have more power, they have more experience, and therefore they actually suggested the policy. It's not the elected leader who make the policy decisions. Maybe the policy decisions has actually been made by the bureaucrats. Well, this another title is lying to get votes. Well, the example again from Australia here. Tony Abbott promised not to cut the funding to ABC, our national broadcaster, not to increase tests, not to cut funding to the schools, but we all know that all these promises are now broken. So whatever they say at the election sometimes doesn't carry through. So why we have to trust politicians if they are lying? Another witness is that the leaders, the politicians, is subject to their parties. So when the parties have different fractions, the fractions themselves have a lot of influence in terms of policy. So when we are trying to elect the so-called senators or House of Representatives or whatever into the parliament, we are actually electing a very small influence factor. The major factor is actually the party themselves. And again, as an ordinary citizen, you have no right unless you participate in the parties. Otherwise, you will not be able to change the party's policy. So democracy is not really democracy in a sense. It is only an indirect election. You are electing some representative, and the sub-representatives are being dictated by their parties with their party policies. So, is that real democracy? Well, one of the weaknesses of democracy is the fallacy that consider majority is right. Well, we know that at some point in the past, everybody living at that time believed the earth is flat. So, is majority always right? Well, usually not necessarily the case. So when we have democracy, the minority have to obey the majority that is actually trusting that the majority is right. But unfortunately, it's not always the case. Now with party system running, the parties will have their own policy, and the policy will occupy the public space. and any other ideas. For example, what I'm trying to propose here, presenting here, the idea that democracy has its own witness, will not have the same public attention. That means alternate idea is actually being drowned down by major parties. Minor parties have little chance of their policy publicly and ethically discussed. Especially in pre-election, the candidates need to silence the noisy minority, and this noisy minority can be the extremes within the party, and therefore they have to propose policies which will appease these extreme factions, and therefore makes the policy more radicalization of extreme political ideologies, because they need to silence the noisy minorities who usually is more extreme. That go back to the idea of using the public purse to buy votes. Almost all democracy have government debts. The government always run in deficit. In many cases, the government do not have any plan to pay back the deficit. That means eventually somebody has to pay. Who is that somebody? Future generations, our children and grandchildren. So what we are spending today is our children's fortune. When one party is in government, the other party's leadership, expertise, knowledge, skills, etc. is just waiting in the line. It's not being used. So we are wasting a lot of political leadership. If both parties, let's say 50-50, both have different good leaders, but in a two-party system, only one party is in power, the other party not in power, the party not in power, the whatever abilities or knowledge will not be utilized. So that is a very large waste of political leadership. Political parties also have their own ideologies. They will only support candidates meeting their own ideologies. So again, that is something we have discussed before. It's a interactions between the leadership and some hands behind the screen. Somebody is actually manipulating the workings or policies of a political parties, and most of the time when we try to elect a leader, we are not really electing leader. We are trying to just to pick a policy. And worst of all, sometimes this policy is not apparent until the party is in power. And when the party is in power, suddenly you find that, wow, what kind of policy is that? All the policy is not they promised. Just like what we are having at the moment with Tony Abbott. The powerful fractions in the party always influence the elected leaders. For example, the last before Tony Abbott, we have the Labour in Australia here. Calvin Rudd was elected as the when the party win power, he was the leader. So we assume Calvin Rudd will be a prime minister throughout the term. But the powerful fractions inside the party removed him in the middle of the term and put forward another person. So again, powerful fractions in party really influence the policies, which in a democracy we believe we are voting for that policy. But no, in fact, it is the party politics that's more important than the votes that we cast. So that whole idea of democracy is a delusion, it's an illusion. Even when democracy is working, a solution is always a compromise. By being a compromise, that means it is not optimal. You cannot have there are too many parties to please. So therefore, you cannot have an optimal solution by definition. Now, the political parties tend to polarize the general public, because if they have the same principles, same ideas, then this kind of ideas is not discussed because they agree. So they don't discuss. Any debates and discussions tend to focus on the difference rather than the common, and therefore political parties tend to polarize. That is a result. So up to now, I have presented to you 20 different witnesses of democracy. Again, here I'm not trying to propose a solution to the current political system. I'm not proposing any solution. But what I'm trying to say is that acknowledging then that there is a problem is the first step in finding a solution. I hope I convince you that democracy has its problem. We need to start looking to find a different political system so that we can organize our human society in a better way. That is my point on this. And thank you very much for listening to me. And I hope you can, if you like what I'm saying, please help spread the idea and let other people also know about these ideas. As I said, this is a minority view, and the attention space is not given to ideas like what I'm trying to tell you. But since you are at the very last stage, you have been staying with me for this amount of time, I thank you very much. And please, if you think the idea worth spreading, please help. Thank you. Bye-bye.